Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy and you're watching The Morgue, where we take a scalpel to the MMO industry and cut it open to see what makes it tick. Now in today's episode, we're going to be covering two games which, again, much like last week's episode, have not yet been released. The first of these titles is set to crawl its way out of its developer's womb, carrying with it the hopes and fears of an entire subgenre. That is, of course, Age of Empires Online, which will be one of the very first ever big-budget MMORTSs. The second game we're going to discuss tonight is the recently dead, buried, and unmourned Apb. We're going to find out if this zombie relaunch of a title that was once considered dead can actually draw in crowds. But before we get into those two games, I'd like to cover a topic that I discussed at the end of last week's episode, namely Rift. I offered to do a little bit of a post-mortem this episode about how the game is doing just a few months after its launch. Well, to be frank, there's not much out there to talk about it this time, at least not from an outsider's point of view. You see, beyond the very fanatic following that they've developed within their own community, there's very little news to be found on exactly how the game is progressing. So, to fill in the gaps, I'm asking for your assistance. If you are an active subscriber or a former subscriber to Rift, leave a comment wherever you're watching this and tell me how you feel about how the game is progressing. The best comments will be shared on a future episode. In addition to that, if you'd like to join the ongoing discussion going on over at Jupiter Colony, follow the link in our show notes to the thread already in progress. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it and get an active dialogue going on the subject. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into Age of Empires Online. Age of Empires Online is one of the very first big-budget games attempting to meld the existing genres of MMO and RTS. RTS, of course, being real-time strategy. Now, there have been a couple other titles that have tried this in the past, but none that are launching with such fanfare and reasonable amount of hype, which means that a lot of hopes are riding on this title as to whether or not this subgenre can actually survive in the MMO landscape. But is the concept sound? I mean, when you get right down to it, do you want their chocolate and your peanut butter? Well, let's take a look at some of the defining attributes of each of these subgenres and find out what exactly Age of Empires Online is doing to bring the two together. The first of these that I want to discuss is actually one of the largest, and the one that has been modified the most extensively in order to adapt the existing Age of Empires franchise into the MMO space, and that is the concept of progression. You see, in a standard single-player RTS campaign, progression is controlled by just a few simple facts. The first of which is technology unlocks. As you progress through the campaign, you earn new technologies and new buildings until to a certain point you have every unit available to you. At that point, which is usually somewhere in the mid-realm of the actual campaign itself, then progression is completely controlled by the difficulty of the scenario itself. In other words, it's not character progression, it's player progression. In order to win, you have to get better. Now, in the MMO landscape, this is not something that is generally accepted. There is always a certain amount of player skill involved, but when you're marketing yourself to a group that is, for the majority, a casual group of gamers, you can't make the end goal out of sight. So in order to address this, the developers of Age of Empires Online have broken down progression into several different substratas that are common to the MMO industry. They've introduced the concept of character progression into the RTS, where the character is your empire itself. A few specific ways in which your empire will progress throughout this game are you will actually level up. Now, leveling up is done through the standard means of gaining experiences by overcoming obstacles. When you level up, you're given points that you can spend on technology trees to progress your empire down specific routes. In a way, this mirrors class progression, as you'll see in talent trees in WoW or soul progression in Rift. Additionally, as you go along in this game and progress through mission after mission on the campaigns, you'll also be picking up loot, which can be equipped to your individual units. Every unit of that type will then gain that loot as an upgrade. Now, think back to what I was saying about single-player RTS campaigns, about the two primary forms of progression being through technology unlocks and player skill. Well, in Age of Empires Online, you've still got technology unlocks, however, they're earned through nothing more than gaining levels. I actually see that as a good thing, because it gives players more of a sense of control and more a sense of personalization of their actual empire. However, on the subject of player skill, even though the missions you can undertake in Age of Empires Online do tend to gradually increase in difficulty, this stumbling block can be easily overcome by simply inviting your friends to join you on the mission, where you then massively overpower the enemy that was once a challenge for you on your own. Now, socialization, I'll never talk badly about it. But you have to wonder if in this particular melding, if the cost of that traditional gameplay element from the single-player RTSs and its loss through socialization is worth it. Now, the last big MMO mechanic that I want to mention that has been kind of shoehorned into this RTS is crafting. Now, crafting factors into both your technology unlocks, because you have to unlock the technology to be able to craft certain items, and your acquisition of gear, since some very good items can be crafted at your home empire. I, however, do not consider the current existing version of crafting in Age of Empires to actually be an enjoyable aspect of this MMO RTS. The primary reason being that these crafting materials that you will pick up everywhere are, literally, everywhere. You will find them on bandit camps, you will receive them for completing missions, you will receive them for building random buildings within your hometown, and in no time flat, your entire inventory will be filled with stuff you cannot use. This necessitates you becoming a part of the community as you try to sell your excess wares. However, since there's also no guide on which materials you'll eventually need for what, you may find yourself selling something that was very rare and needing it 2 days later. The exorbitant price of additional storage capacity is outside the reach of almost every new player, resulting in a very confusing and frustrating experience early on. Now, despite this initial bad taste in my mouth from experiencing their crafting system, I can definitely see where this would eventually lead to being a very good thing for the game as a whole. Not only giving each empire, each player, something to strive for on their own, but also enhancing a sense of community through a robust economy. And since the technologies required to craft are actually driven by you advancing in levels, it will also keep people playing even longer if they have an interest in this particular mechanic. But again, it is something that simply does not exist in the RTS arena, so players that traditionally enjoy a real-time strategy game may find this just as frustrating as I have. Now, let's put all that aside for just 1 minute and talk about another very key component of MMOs that you will not usually find in an RTS and had to be a part of this game in order to add the MMO to this RTS. That factor is persistence. You see, in an RTS, you are the player. You are the hand of God. You are nobody and you are everybody. You don't have anything that you particularly control except perhaps a hero character that you might identify with. That is not the case in Age of Empires Online. You are an empire. You control a portion of land which nobody can invade, and there is never a sense of urgency or loss when you are unable to overcome a particular obstacle. If you fail to defeat the bandits on a particular map, the game is not over, you have not lost the campaign, you simply have to go back to your home empire, pick up the mission again, and try again. You don't lose resources, you don't lose people, and you don't lose progress. Now, I know some of you out there are saying, well, that sounds like an ideal situation. There's no real sense of loss, and I don't like playing a game that's not fun, and losing is not fun. Let me point out, however, that loss is an incredible motivator to get you to try harder. And without risk, every reward feels a little less rewarding. Now, the sense of persistence is actually what's leading some people to compare this game to, sadly enough, a Facebook game. You see, everybody in this game, since they own their own plot of land and they have their own kingdom, which they can decorate and build up however they like, there's also this substrata to the social and economic aspects of the game where you want friends or strangers to come and visit your kingdom to see how magnificently it is arrayed with your fountains and urns and all of this other decorative hoopachoop. All right, so up to this point I've been talking about everything that they added to these games in order to meld the MMO with the RTS, but I haven't so far covered what might have been lost in that transaction. There's really only a couple things, and I won't really call either of these game killers outright, but it might be things that a fan of an RTS will not like to see missing in this title. The first of which is an engaging campaign story. In almost every really successful RTS, from Warcraft to StarCraft to Age of Empires to Command & Conquer, all of these have very strong story elements to the ongoing campaign. You beat a map or a mission and you're frequently treated to a cutscene or some sort of voiceover dialogue where you watch the story progress to the next logical point. Well, in Age of Empires Online, because it's such a more open structure to the missions, wherein you gain access to certain ones depending on which talents you've gained as you level up, you can't really place a solid narrative wrapper around all of that. What this results in is a loss of sense of immersion in the game world that you're participating in. And if you lack immersion, then the IP doesn't matter. And that's a sad thing to see coming from such a strong and well-established franchise as Age of Empires. But when it comes down to it, if you don't care about the story, if you don't care about the world that you're living in, then Age of Empires could be replaced by anything, and no one would really care. And the other thing that's lost because of this melding of the genres is any sense of urgency. As I mentioned earlier, since there's no loss incurred by actually failing a campaign mission, and since your empire can never be invaded by enemies or anything of that nature, this, combined with the lack of immersion and really caring about the world, kind of leaves me coming up dry. It leaves me wondering why I'm playing this game in the first place. And why should I care? Well, I guess the answer to that comes back to the gameplay mechanics, which are some of the primary aspects of what I discussed earlier. I don't think this game is intended for primarily an RTS audience. I don't think this game is primarily intended for an audience of MMO players. In fact, I can't really tell who this is aimed at. I think a more casual type of gamer that's wanting something a little more robust than the average RTS and isn't already married to that genre. So, I guess the final verdict is, do I think that this is going to be a success or not? Well, with the clout of Microsoft behind this title, I have a good feeling that it will be, plus I've already been hearing some really good hype and reviews on it, so despite it not entirely being up my alley, I do believe that Age of Empires Online will be a success, especially since it's going to be free to play, reducing the barrier for entry. Now, the term free-to-play is misleading, as most of us know, since all of these titles are typically accompanied with a cash shop where you can buy items online to further enhance your gameplay experience. The developers of Age of Empires Online have come out on record as saying that they do not want to turn Age of Empires Online into a game where you can pay to win. They're planning to launch only content on their in-game store. However, in the same breath, they've also mentioned that the store may be used to unlock special units, and that sounds to me like something that can have an effect on gameplay itself. Until the store itself is actually available to us for us to look at and examine their pricing structure and everything of that nature, it's a little too early to make the call. However, I will warn anybody interested in getting into this game that just because it says free does not mean you will not end up spending money on it. And that same sentiment is actually true for the next game I'd like to discuss with you. Apb Reloaded is coming out soon, and it will include a cash shop. But what about all the other pitfalls that the previous APB had? Has Gamers First managed to fix the issues that the original APB faced? And what potential ramifications could the success of this relaunch have on the industry in general? Find out next as we take a first impressions look at Apb Reloaded. Cash shops, the money-grubbing nickel and diming of the MMO industry. Pretty much everybody hates these things in the Western markets, but let's face it, they become the bread and butter of the Eastern MMO markets. Practically every Eastern MMO relies upon a cash shop that not only fuels their entire development budget, but also very frequently encourages players to pay to win. The relaunch of Apb Reloaded is being headed up by a company out of Korea called Gamers First. So it shouldn't be a great surprise that the cash shop for Apb Reloaded will include weapons, cars, ammo, boosts to your character. All of these are temporary things, but nonetheless, they are ways to encourage players to spend real-life money to get an edge in combat. In a game that is driven entirely by PvP-focused content, this is something that's going to turn off a lot of players. And marketing the game as a free-to-download, free-to-play title when in order to survive you have to spend money is a bit disingenuous. On the other hand, if you've got a credit card with a high limit and you want to have a rocket launcher on day one, boom. And to be honest, I wouldn't be so opposed to the concept of a pay-to-win in a free-to-play title of this nature if it weren't for the fact that this entire game is driven by players going up against other players. Many people have compared the gameplay of Apb Reloaded to Grand Theft Auto, but when it comes down to interpersonal disputes in this game, they're handled much more similarly to a matchmaking first-person shooter like Counter-Strike or Unreal Tournament or Quake, something of that nature. The combat is extremely brutal, very vicious and fast-paced, and the addition of a cash shop that can improve your performance on a very real basis in that type of a game would never fly, at least not within Western markets. So, will this lead to the demise of Apb Reloaded? I don't think that's likely. If anything is the downfall of Apb, it's the fact that the gameplay itself does not tend to focus on what MMOers are after. People that enjoy titles like WoW and Rift and EverQuest and EVE are not generally going to find themselves enthralled by the gameplay aspects of Apb Reloaded. I don't doubt that there's an audience there. I just don't think that it's the traditional MMO gamer, which is a little disappointing for this particular MMO gamer because APB also includes something that every MMOer will love to death. If you've already seen the videos out there of character customization that APB is offering, all of this is still intact under the relaunch version coming out under the Gamer's First banner. From hairstyles to self-designed tattoos, body type, sliders for everything. And this is the kind of stuff that an MMO gamer eats up. Hell, I think an MMO gamer might buy this title for this alone and not even bother ever firing a single bullet. And when you get right down to it, this is the sole reason that I'm interested in seeing APB Reloaded actually succeed, is because there is no other MMO currently on the market that offers this level of customization of your avatar in-game. We have seen a few other games that are coming out in the future that are offering similar customization, most notably Eve, but to date, no title has shown success while offering this many features. Now, I have a couple things to say about that. One is that the continued success of APB Reloaded, or any game that offers this level of customization, is only a good thing for the industry as a whole because it will encourage other developers to take that concept and run with it, further enhancing their own character customization so that in the future, other games can embrace that and offer us the ability to look like exactly what we want to look like as our avatars. The second thing I want to say to it is actually a reference back to the cash shop earlier. You see, Gamers First has decided to put things like weapons and cars and power sets onto the cash shop when they could have instead put tattoos or hairstyles or facial sliders or earring packs or shirts or pants or shoes or car decals or whatever they wanted to. They could have made the customization of this game drive the monetization effort of their in-game cash shop. They chose a different route. I can't say I agree, but I do wish them the best of success on that, as long as they're not after my money. Now, the last subject I want to cover on APB Reloaded is actually a little bit more far-reaching. You see, over the course of my years within the MMO industry as a gamer, I've seen many high-budget games fail. Some of the most notable I brought up on the previous episode: Tabula Rasa, Auto Assault, Matrix Online, Stargate Worlds. There have been literally hundreds of good quality, high budget titles that have simply not seen the light of day or been canceled before their prime. Now think back to some of those favorites. I know a lot of you out there have been interested in one title or another that just never made it. Well, what if a company like Gamers First had come along at the perfect point in time and rescued your title and dug it out of the cemetery and resurrected it for everybody to play with? I'm sure you would have been interested in seeing that game succeed, and I can only hope that APB Reloaded can actually succeed because of that. Adding an extra layer of hope to the MMO industry for the really innovative titles is something that is never a bad thing for the industry as a whole. And I think we can all attest to the fact that some of those games we loved and never got to play, or only got to play for a very short of time, were likely canceled by greedy publishers. At least, that's the impression we get. So if more companies out there start being willing to take a risk on a game that has either flopped or simply not made enough profit to ingratiate themselves with their initial publisher, then we, as gamers, may suddenly be faced with a lot more options, a lot more freedom to be able to play the games that we like to play. So despite my misgivings on APB Reloaded as a game in general, there are many reasons that I'd like to see it succeed, and I will be keeping a close eye on things as they progress. Well, that about wraps us up for this week's episode of The Morgue. I hope you guys have all enjoyed it, and feel free to leave your comments wherever you're watching this. If you have any further commentary to add on these particular games, I have a lot to say about both of them. Age of Empires Online and APB Reloaded are pretty close to my heart for different reasons. So head on over to jupitercolony.com, look for the Morgue subforum, and if you have any questions about either, I would love to talk to you about them. Coming up on episode 3 of The Morgue, it will be a very superhero-y edition, as we're going to take a look at some of the behind-the-scenes news that's been coming out of Marvel Universe Online, as well as some of the trials and tribulations that have recently been faced by DC Universe in light of Sony Online's recent network outage. After that, some major news from Champions Online creator Cryptic Studios, and wouldn't you know it, I've got something to say about that. So until then, everybody, play smart, and may all your die rolls be natural 20s. Age of Empires Online. That was a good start, don't you think? It was strong. It was right there. It was like, that's what I'm talking about. I hear an ice cream man driving by. and which had to be added in order to create and had to be added in order to accurately and had to be added in order to things that do stuff with this junk. Yeah, I'll keep that. Why not?